His was a household name. Today he is largely forgotten, except by a small coterie of scholars. And I was reflecting on a well-known aphorism some days ago, that there is no such thing as history, there is only biography. That reflects a theory that it is individual men, great men, who actually form and fashion the destiny of nations and of churches. And there is some truth in that. Martin Luther made the Reformation, Adolf Hitler made the Second World War, and to a large extent Thomas Chalmers has made modern Scottish church history. Chalmers was flourishing and being educated in a revolutionary age. He was born in 1780. The French Revolution occurred, as you can recall, 9 years later, and Waterloo occurred in 1815 when Chalmers was still a relatively young man. 1828, Catholic emancipation, which allowed the Catholic Church to have its own clergy and bishops for the first time since the Reformation in Scotland. 1832, the Great Reform Bill, the Reform Act of 1833, which extended the franchise to a large proportion of the male population of the UK. Women were still, of course, not enfranchised. That didn't happen until 1919. But we had an extension of democracy through this Reform Bill. 1843, the disruption, which fragmented the Protestant Church of Scotland irrevocably. All of those occurrences took place in Chalmers' own tempestuous lifetime. If I may digress for a moment, Chalmers was by temperament an aristocrat and a conservative. And it is in many ways a paradox and irony that a man of such mentality was the agent often of revolutionary movements. When New College was opened or had its foundation stone laid in 1846, Chalmers gave a pledge then that no idea subversive of the order of society would ever be preached or taught within the halls of that new college. He was paranoid about the charge of being a subversive and revolutionary. And he pledged the new college, the new Free Church College as it was then, not to align itself with any such revolutionary or subversive movement. And yet, despite his own temperament, he was instrumental in changing the whole face of Scotland, both socially and ecclesiastically. If I give you first of all a brief outline of Chalmers' career. He was born, as I said, in 1780. He was inducted in 1803 to the congregation of Kilmany in Fife at the age of 22. He went to St Andrews as Professor of Moral Phil later on, and to Edinburgh to teach divinity in the 1820s. But he spent the most significant part of his life as a pastor in the city of Glasgow, first in the Thron parish and then in St John's parish. And in those parishes conducted his famous experiment in the relief of poverty and in urban evangelism. So, as you can see, there is a very wide spread of experience from the rural parish of Kilmany to academic life, and then in between this exposure to urban social problems and urban evangelism. In Kilmany, Chalmers really put the ministry very much on the back burner. It wasn't all that important to him. He had, in those early days, a Christian faith which was purely intellectual and rational. He believed in the fundamental doctrines of the Bible, in God's existence, in the resurrection of Christ from the dead, in the Ten Commandments and no doubt in immortality as well. He believed also, oddly enough, in predestination and God's sovereignty, because that gave him a kind of magnificent overarching vision for his own scientific pursuits. But his main interests in those Kilmarny days were in his own hobbies, in mathematics, in astronomy, and in chemistry. And his ambition was to become a noted writer in one or all of these fields, and by that means secure academic preferment in some secular branch of human learning. And so he read in those disciplines, and he lectured in chemistry at College St Andrews, and made plain that these were his preoccupations. An old godly neighbour came to visit him one Saturday evening and found Chalmers busy at one or other of those pursuits. And he said to Chalmers, who even then wasn't a lazy man, "I find you busy, sir, but never at your preparations for the Sabbath." And Chalmers then said that 2 hours late on Saturday night was sufficient for the Sabbath, 2 hours late on Saturday. And he argued also that 2 days a week was sufficient for his parish ministry, and left an abundance of time for other secular and academic pursuits. So that was the original and natural Chalmers, energetic, ambitious, cool, academic, moderate, with a very kind of loose commitment to a moralistic Christianity. Later in life, Chalmers argued strenuously against what were called pluralities, a system whereby ministers could hold more than one charge and could also hold university posts and university chairs. And Chalmers himself tried to be both pastor and academic for a while. He later saw the futility and impossibility of such a combination and wrote strenuously against such pluralities. He was arguing once in the assembly against such pluralism when one of his opponents rose and waved a pamphlet in which Chalmers had argued years before that 2 days a week sufficed for a minister's duties. And Chalmers was naturally mortified by this very clever intervention. And he rose and made a memorable speech in response to the intervention. And the core of that speech was that he had to confess that yes, he had spent his early years in the ministry immersed in mathematics, not in the work of the gospel or of his parish. And he said, turning to the moderator, "What, sir, is the business of mathematics? Magnitudes and the proportions of magnitudes." "But sir," he said, "I had forgotten 2 magnitudes. I thought not of the brevity of time, and I had thought not of the magnitude of eternity." And these proportions, this overwhelming sense of the brevity of time and the imminence of eternity, really was a driving force throughout Chalmers' ministry. But what was it that brought the change about? Chalmers was ordained as an unconverted, young, notional Christian. But sometime about 8 years afterwards, he underwent a radical spiritual change, a conversion no less. And there were 3 factors instrumental in that conversion. First of all, he suffered a series of close family bereavements. His brother died and his sister of tuberculosis within a short space of each other. And his favourite uncle also died. And those three bereavements really struck Chalmers very, very forcibly. Shortly after that, he read a book by William Wilberforce, the slave emancipationist, called Practical Christianity. And that book brought home to Chalmers very forcibly that a large number of nominal Christians were not in fact Christians at all. They did not have any kind of practical Christianity. And Chalmers saw that he himself belonged to that number. He had no practical discipleship as far as Christ was concerned. To an extent, this was doctrinal, but the whole point was there was no warmth, there was no personalness, there was no enthusiasm, no reality in his religion. It was purely notional. And then he himself became seriously ill. In fact, he almost died of pneumonia. And he himself thought he was going to die. He was confined to his room for 4 months, unable to preach for 6 months, and recovered fully only after 2 years. And during that time, Chalmers was face to face with the last enemy, having lost close friends and dear ones just before that, having also read Wilberforce and seen his own unpreparedness, and then dramatically face to face with eternity and with his Maker. He emerged from that illness a radically changed man. He was changed doctrinally because in the past he had had no favor at all, no love for evangelical doctrine like the atonement or justification by faith alone. He had no sense of the depravity of man. After his conversion, these doctrines, the depravity of man, the foundational nature of the atonement by Christ's death as our substitute, justification by faith alone, these became the core beliefs of Chalmers' soul. He himself claimed once that the fundamental doctrine in all his preaching was the depravity of man. He also said once, "What would Thomas Chalmers do were it not that God justified the ungodly?" And that was a tremendous reversal, because in his pre-conversion days, Chalmers preached, as he said, simply virtue, and salvation by virtue, and by human morality. And now here he was, utterly and radically changed in his own beliefs, and seeing that only by faith in the death of Christ there was salvation at all possible. Years afterwards, or when he left Kilmallock, to be more precise, he told his parishioners of his conducting an unwitting experiment among them. And he told them, "For years," he said, "I tried to moralize and elevate you by preaching the law and preaching morality. I told you not to steal, and I told you not to swear, and I told you not to slander, and I told you about all those other virtues. And none of my preaching of all that morality or all that virtue made any practical difference in your lifestyle. But then," he said, "I began to preach forgiveness by the blood of Christ, and I saw the whole parish change. Not by preaching virtue or morality, but by preaching the love of God and the forgiveness that comes to us through the blood of His Son. So Chalmers goes through this very dark and very long valley, emerges with his beliefs all transformed, but also with his whole perspective on life transformed. I mentioned already his awareness of the brevity of time and the magnitude of eternity. He also emerged saying that this life was nothing but the illusion of an instant. The illusion of an instant. And he spoke too about the insignificance not only of time itself, but also of this earth. Again, there is this mathematical, numerate tendency always in Chalmers. And he said that the loss of this globe on which we stand, that is the earth itself, would make, he said, no more difference to the universe than the fall of a leaf in a mighty forest. So there is a kind of double sense of insignificance. At one level, the sense of temporal insignificance, the brevity of time. At another, the sense of spatial insignificance. And out of that there comes, with Chalmers, a tremendous commitment from that point onwards to the work of the gospel and the work of the ministry. This man who had said, 2 hours will do to prepare for the Sabbath, 2 days a week to serve my parish, he now finds that it demands and needs all his time and all his energy and all his passion and all his enthusiasm. And Chalmers became so utterly and so sharply focused upon the work of the ministry, and becomes a driven man, driven by this enthusiasm for the work to which God has called him. And I suppose that never has Scotland seen such a single-minded ministry, where what really is a colossal intellect of tremendous awareness, aware of all that's going round about him, so tremendously cerebral. And yet, all this great range of interests and of awarenesses is always being focused in and homed in upon the work of the gospel and the promotion of the kingdom of God. So here we have this new man, Chalmers, and this tremendous sharpening of focus. And he pours himself with tremendous energy into a whole series of gospel aspirations and gospel projects. Now, Chalmers was probably fairly unlike me in his mental constitution. Chalmers was a pragmatist. And he didn't have a great deal of patience with the minutiae of theology. And I think even less with the minutiae of canon law and church administration. In some ways, Chalmers would ask, will this work? And he wanted things that would work. He wanted doctrine that worked. He wanted structures that worked. He wanted ideas, doctrines, preachings, organization that would change the spiritual face of Scotland. And he would leave a large area of church work to others. He wasn't interested in it. He would go outside the church if need be, because the great thing was the gospel itself. And I think that is an important question that he raises for us. God will have all men to be saved. And our structures, our machinery, our canon law, ought never to get in the way of the gospel. And if it does inhibit or limit the gospel, then it has to be examined and jettisoned. Chalmers always is a pragmatist asking, how can we advance the gospel, or what he called the Christian good of Scotland? And so he pours himself into a series of great projects. One was the church extension project. This is a very early to Chalmers, going back to the 1820s. I think the picture we have often of that age is pretty miscued, because we assume that in those days you had universal church attendance and you had churches everywhere. In actual fact, at this point in Scotland's history, church attendance was not at all high. When Chalmers went to Glasgow to the Thron parish, he found that only about 10% of the population had any real connection with a church, and that's only a connection. It wasn't a commitment, but they had some kind of connection. What's even more interesting is that in those days, there weren't enough churches in our major cities for the population. What had happened was that with the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 18th century, thousands had poured into Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, and Aberdeen. But these cities had churches only on the pre-Reformation scale, only a very small number of parish churches. And for most people, there was no local church to go to. There was a further problem as well, that such churches as there were had seat rents, and you had to pay to have a pew church. It seems incredible to us, but that was a practice. And for the poor, that was a great deterrent. And Chalmers therefore set about trying to initiate and inspire and organize a church extension movement. And he did this, of course, with the Assembly's permission and with its sanction. At the beginning, he tried to raise money from the government, because he argued that it was to their benefit to build churches and moralize the population. But he found that the government was not at all forthcoming with the necessary funds until, in fact, much later, when the government did build what were called the parliamentary churches. And so he set about raising funds himself through the Church Extension Fund, and he raised a huge amount of money and doubled the number of churches in Edinburgh and other cities. And this again was just part of the same underlying drive to make the gospel meaningful and impactful in the changed world of his own day. Now, it was a changed world. The old rural economy was being transformed by mass migration to the industrial cities. You had a very dangerous spirit of revolution among the weavers and other workers as a result of the Chartist movement and the revolution in France. There was a great deal of unsettledness and the danger of real explosion. And Chalmers was aware that unless there were churches in every part of the city, there was no hope of reaching out to the gospel to those communities. He also involved himself in the New Bible Society movement and gave it his unquestioned support. And he also involved himself in the missionary movement. Now, that again may seem to us kind of surprising. Is that important or interesting? Don't we all have a missionary interest? But in the 1820s, missions were not high on the Scottish Church's agenda. At the turn of the century, the Haldane brothers, who founded the Baptist movement in Scotland, they had a passion for mission. But the established church had no such passion. And it is an amazing thing that the first Church of Scotland missionary was Alexander Duff of Calcutta, who was one of Chalmers' students in St. Andrews. And it was through Chalmers' inspiration that people began to raise money for missions, to correspond with missionaries abroad, and to immerse themselves in the work of the various missionary societies, which did exist, although there was no church as called a missionary commitment. There were some other bodies working in these fields. And Chalmers gave these movements his own total endorsement. Chalmers also involved himself in one of the great controversies of that day, the so-called voluntary controversy. Now, bear with me on this. If we go back to the 1820s, you had in Scotland one mega church, the established church. You also had the Secession Church and some other smaller churches. Now, the established church was an endowed church, and it had, in various complicated ways, it had support from public funds. And the non-established churches naturally resented the special privileges of the Kirk. And they began to agitate against the paying of relevant taxes, the teams and so on, and to say that it was unfair for them who belonged to the Secession Church or the Independents or the Baptist Church. Why should we pay those taxes? Why should we pay the teams? And they began to argue for disestablishment and the disendowment of the church. That goes back a long way, and there were parallel movements, of course, in Wales and Ireland as well, linked to the whole agitation for Irish Home Rule. Now, Chalmers was an enthusiastic advocate of establishment and of endowment. There is an irony there, as we'll see, but he was an enthusiast for endowment and establishment. And he argued for it on the principle that the government itself stood to gain immensely from endowing the church to preach the gospel because of the effects of that gospel. And Chalmers argued that for every soul the church saved, it moralized another 10. It civilized as well as saved. And therefore, he said, the nation as a whole, the state as a state, has a vested interest in supporting the gospel and in financing gospel ordinances. This, he said, is a great use of public funds. It is the best possible use of public funds. Now, I doubt if that resonates very much with any of us here tonight, although it does instead resonate with me. And it is interesting to reflect on what use public funds are put to in our own day and generation. And to reflect even on the many demoralizing and perhaps even evil and wicked causes to which public funds are diverted. The arts are not wicked, but the arts are massively endowed, despite Mr. Linklater's claims to the contrary in this country. They are massively endowed in this country. Now, whether those arts moralize is another question. All kinds of minorities benefit from lottery funding. Chalmers was saying it is a perfectly legitimate, laudable, plausible, beneficial thing for the state to endow the church to do its own spiritual work in the community. And although I don't want to politicize this, I do think that the churches ought to agitate very much more along these lines, because if you look at the current scale of youth problems in this country, in Scotland today, one of the few agencies involved in remedial work among youth is the Christian Church in its various branches. And yet the churches are struggling to provide funds, buildings, workers in any of those areas. In other words, Chalmers was saying, if the state will not provide this funding, not provide the buildings, not provide the manpower we need, then we face the demoralization of our urban population. That's what he said. And I think that's what's happened. Now, going back to the New Testament, let me say at once, the church then had no funds. I accept that. But this was, in those days, officially a Christian country. Chalmers was saying more or less, give us the money and we will do the job. The government said no, the church couldn't do the job, and the result is what we find in Britain and in Scotland today. So Chalmers argued strenuously both in Edinburgh and in London for endowment of the church and establishment of the church's ministry. So he was committed along all those areas to pragmatic and evangelistically effective means of advancing kingdom of God. Church extension, Bible societies, missionaries, endowment, all of these were part of the same great driving concern. And that was true also Chalmers' involvement in the non-intrusion controversy. Now, pardon me again on this one, but I'll explain it as quickly as I can. Non-intrusion was a protest by the evangelicals in the Church of Scotland from about 1832 to 1843 against the fact that the local landowner, in practice, chose the parish minister. And the congregation had no say. Now, that is a fairly bald statement which might need some fine-tuning in some other context, but in essence, that is what happened. The landlord had to maintain the building, and he was the local patron, and he chose who should be the local parish minister. In effect, this was an attempt to secularize the church. It was perhaps again linked to the concern that there should be no revolutionary agitation, and it was felt that the local landowners were so conservative that they would choose men who would not be at all radical or revolutionary. I went back to an Act of Parliament of Queen Anne in the year 1712. Now, the church protested against this practice for many years, but gradually it just gave up protesting and acquiesced in the situation until Thomas Chalmers came along. And around Chalmers there was a large number of able young men, in some senses more radical than he himself was on this particular issue. But come back to Chalmers the pragmatist, Chalmers the gospel pragmatist. Some men like William Cunningham, they were offended by the bad theology of intrusion, of the landlord intruding a minister. That, they said, was bad theology. It was a violation of the rights of the Christian people, a violation of the headship of Christ and of the crown rights of King Jesus. That's what the theologians said. But what Chalmers said was, patronage, those landowners, they put the wrong kind of men in our pulpits. They don't want evangelists. They don't want preachers. They want men with polished manners. They want men for the drawing rooms, men of culture, of morality. Or they want, in the rural areas, they want men who are experts with a rod and with a gun. That's what they want. That was Chalmers' view. He left it to Cunningham to argue about theology, but for him the problem was that the patrons were always putting non-evangelical men into the pulpits. And out of that came Chalmers' protest. Now, it wasn't easy, of course, to agitate on this issue because the law of the land said that the patrons did have those rights. The Assembly in 1834 passed what was known as the Veto Act, and there is an interesting and intriguing sexist element in this. The Veto Act gave male heads of families the right to veto the patron's nominee. Now, the patron was still left with the right to nominate, but the heads of families could veto this nomination and force him to have another nomination. But this was limited, as I said, to the male heads of families. The sexist issue, in parenthesis, emerges again soon after the Free Church comes into being, because there is a debate very early on in the 1840s as to whether women could have a vote in electing ministers. And that went the woman's way. You may be glad to know the Free Church may be a little bit proud of that, bit of pro-feminist theology. But here was Chalmers, driven by the concern to have the right men in the pulpit, confident that the people in the pew could make better choices of ministers than could the patron or the landlord, and so giving those men this right of veto. Now, the church then began to implement this veto, and in a succession of cases, the patron's nominee was vetoed, and these nominees, or the patrons, appealed then to the Court of Session. And in a long succession of cases, the Court of Session found against the church, and insisted the church should actually ordain and induct the patron's nominee. And it was this impasse, this head-on collision between the secular courts and the church courts that precipitated in 1843 the disruption that led to the emergence of the Free Church of Scotland. Chalmers was insistent that no power on earth could tell the church who should be its ministers. He acknowledged always that the secular courts could adjudicate on the temporal rights. It could tell the church, you must pay that man X £100. It could tell the church, you must let that man stay in your manse. All that, Chalmers said, that's temporalities. And the courts can deal with temporalities. But when it comes to spiritual matters, who are the church's ministers and who are the church's members and what are the qualifications for induction and ordination, that is a matter for the church itself. In other words, Chalmers was fighting for the church's spiritual independence. Now, the church is not free of the civil and criminal law in every sense. Chalmers never argued that the old Catholic Church, the clergy, were above the criminal law, or that the church itself on temporal matters was above the civil law. But he argued very cogently, with the assistance of Cunningham and others, that on spiritual matters, in such matters as the election and the calling and ordination and induction and discipline of ministers, the church had total independence. And decisions in that area were not open to review by any court, any secular court in the whole world. So these were some of Chalmers's concerns, as I've itemized them. At the personal level, Chalmers was marked by outstanding gifts and graces, and I may briefly enumerate some of those qualities just for a moment. First of all, Chalmers was a brilliant organizer. He wasn't only good at it, but he was a great believer in it and a great insister upon the importance of organization. And this may seem to us a very, very worldly thing. Now, Chalmers said to the Free Church, for example, and Chalmers said again over church extension, he said, Of course, he said, our main reliance is on divine help. And our main access to divine help is by prayer. But that doesn't warrant us doing nothing. And so when Chalmers was trying to extend to building new churches, trying to modernize education for the ministry, trying to launch his brave new free church, he insisted on the importance of organization. Before the disruption, men were sent all over Scotland, the church's most able men, to inform the people. He arranged for the great publicist Hugh Miller to become the church's advocate in the press and founded the Witness newspaper for that purpose, to inform what Chalmers called the general population. And months before the disruption, November 1842, he called a great convocation of ministers, where there was much praying and there was much meditation, but there was also great care to lay the foundations of the new denomination. And the Free Church's emergence was planned as carefully as the D-Day landings in Normandy. And when the day came, everything was in place. Everyone knew what they had to do. And more amazing still, the money was in place, because Chalmers had worked out the principles of what he called the Sustentation Fund, and there were local collectors organized to raise the money to provide stipends for the ministers. It was an unheard of enterprise, because in the past depended and survived by free will offerings. That could be done in the large towns. But to provide over the length and breadth of a nation, a denomination which had a presence in every parish based on free will offerings, that had never been heard of. We today, we think, well, that's so what? But it was a phenomenal achievement. And if I can say so to my Free Church friends tonight, that is perhaps the thing of which we ought to be proudest, that we have managed to maintain a presence not only in urban Scotland with its high population densities, but in rural Scotland with its low population densities. And that's been done because of one fundamental principle which Chalmers elaborated: the strong must help the weak. Some congregations can raise and generate large financial surpluses. They can use those locally for their own aggrandizement, or they can pour that surplus, Chalmers said, into a common pool, and out of it small churches may be subsidized. And Chalmers arranged that throughout the length and breadth of Scotland, in congregations large and small, every pastor had exactly the same basic salary. He might be the pastor of a church in Edinburgh's West End with thousands of wealthy upper middle class people. He had the same salary as minister of the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, because the strong were helping the weak. And Chalmers said to the church that at that time, organize, organize, organize. And we evangelicals must not become so hyper-spiritual as to overlook the importance of that principle. I would be extremely sad if we were to retreat today from our own commitment, our historic commitment to rural mission. There is a fallacy abroad that urban mission is a really hard thing and that rural mission is easy. There is no evidence to support that contention. The providing of gospel ordinances of ministers and buildings in remote country areas is an extremely demanding task for any denomination. So Chalmers said, organize, organize, organize. He'd have understood the man who said, trifles make perfection, but perfection is not a trifle. Chalmers had the knack of attending to trifles. Chalmers was also a great motivator, a great inspirer of men. One of the most remarkable features of his ministry is the number of young men whom it raised up and whom it impelled into vibrant and dynamic Christian service. I've mentioned already Dr. Alexander Duff, who went to India, to Calcutta, as the Kirk's first missionary to the subcontinent. He was one of Chalmers' young men. So was William Cunningham, our greatest ever theologian and theological educator. Andrew Bonar, Horatius Bonar, John Bonar, Robert McChain, John Milne, all of these men, W.C. Burns, these men all came under the spell of Chalmers in the classroom. He was more than simply a lecturer. He was an enthuser, an inspirer of men. He inspired Hugh Miller, the geologist and journalist. He inspired William Collins, founded the publishing house of Collins. He was a Chalmers protege. All over the place, Chalmers was enthusing those, driving them. The deacons in St. John's Parish in Glasgow, Chalmers used to have working breakfasts with these men. And it wasn't easier then to go around the Tongate in Glasgow than it would be today. To go the same slums, the same filth, the same foul language, the same hopelessness on human face as there is today in Glasgow's flea markets. But these men, they went. They went round the doors. And they did so because he knew that Chalmers himself would do it too. Because he'd go round to say the closest. There was a story once of a man who was dying, and somebody said to him, do you want to see a minister? And he said, yes, I would, he said. And he said, send for that man Chalmers, he said. He's been at my door, he said, 40 times. Send for that man Chalmers. Now, he was a man, you see, who was a celebrity far beyond modern clergy. This man was a household name. This man who was given a doctorate by the French and by Oxford. This man who was a household name even in large sections of the American public. And yet this man was visiting in those wines and closest with their a degradation far beyond what we can imagine today. There is nothing today in the Blackfriars part of Edinburgh comparable to what it was in the days of Thomas Chalmers. But he was there, you see, with them. And he was leading by example, going round those doors himself. So he was a great enthuser of men. And I can tell you that if you read Hannah's Life of Chalmers, it's a pretty massive undertaking. It's about 900 pages long in small print. But it will enthuse you too, because still that spirit burns there to enthuse and to inspire you to the work of the Lord. So Chalmers was an organizer. Chalmers was also a user. Chalmers was a theologian too. He wasn't an erudite theologian, and he wasn't an original one. He was more interested in practicalities in the sense that it was the interface between theology and the world, the defense of the gospel. He was one of those men whose driving concern was to commend the gospel to the educated unbeliever. That again is part of his own aristocratic mentality. But it was that interface that Chalmers was concerned with, the whole area of evidences, of natural theology, the interface with science, the way you preached the gospel, the way you evangelized. These were his concerns. He has a systematic theology, which is called the Institutes. It is fairly unusual because it is designed again, it is organized along practical lines. It begins by discussing the disease for which the gospel is a remedy. And then the second main section is the remedy for the disease, the gospel itself. So always that remedial, practical aspect is what appeals to Chalmers, even as a theologian. But there are certain areas in which Chalmers is very interesting. Chalmers was suspected in his lifetime of not being quite sound. And in actual fact, he's being accused today by the hyper-Orthodox in Scotland itself of not being quite sound. There were 2 or 3 areas where Chalmers was very influential. I don't think I'll mention all of them because I'm not sure that all of you share my interests here. But one very important area was the whole question of Christianity and science, Christianity and geology as it was really in those days. Men had just begun to question Ussher's chronology, which argued that the earth was 4004 years BC in its point of origin, and Lyell had established, to my view anyway, and Chalmers' view as well, that on uniformitarian principles this earth was millions of years old. That is, if you make the assumption that the rates of sedimentation have always been as they are today, then you can calculate from the depth of those sedimentary deposits the age of the earth. And the geologists said, well, our belief is that the earth is millions of years old. They weren't specific, and they couldn't in those days engage in radio dating of rock samples and so on, but they argued for millions of years. And this disturbed a large number of clergymen. But it disturbed mainly a large number of Anglican clergy. And it caused little or no commotion among Scottish clergymen. And it did so because Chalmers, as their leader, I suppose, made his view plain from the very outset, that Genesis did not determine the age of the earth. If you ask, when was the earth created, then Genesis says, in the beginning. But when was that beginning? Chalmers says it doesn't tell us. And this is an interesting thing, that Chalmers in fact set the tone and direction for the Scottish Church on this whole interface between Christianity and science. And the Church in Scotland, unlike the Church in England at that time, never had any sympathy with what was called flood geology. They said, geologists say so and so. We see no problem with that. We think they're probably quite right. That's what Chalmers said. Now, Chalmers' own view was that between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and verse 2, there was a gap. And he said that in that gap, before man came onto the earth, we had these millions of years during which we had all those volcanic intrusions and all those great sedimentations that built up sandstone deposits and so on that we find across Europe and correspondingly also North America, the same deposits. That happened, Chalmers said, in the gap between verse 1 and verse 2. Now, that is not sustainable either as biblical interpretation or as science, but Chalmers had set the tone, and others who came after Chalmers, like Hugh Miller and the other great Free Church theologians, they took their cue from that. They were never bothered by the age of the earth question. Hugh Miller gave popularity to the idea that the days of Genesis were in fact not 24-hour days, but but they were creation eras, which was what Augustine had also argued. Now, I'm not hugely fussed about this. I just want to say that there is nothing very modern or 20th century in my position, that I'm quite happy with a universe which is 15 billion years old. I don't have a problem with that. And I don't have a problem because as a very young man, when I was 19, I read Chalmers and I came across this, and I've done all my thinking since in that particular matrix, and I've been quite comfortable with it. And I've been a bit disturbed in recent years. We've gone much more along towards the American fundamentalist perspective, which insists on a young earth theory. But for the meantime, I'm simply saying that these old Scottish theologians were in trouble by geology. And when Darwin came along later on, they weren't hugely troubled by Darwin either. I think they were maybe more naive on that one. But even many Charles Spurgeon weren't all that concerned by Darwin either. Darwin, of course, when he wrote his Origin of Species, was himself a believer in God, and the book itself is not an anti-God book, although Darwin died as an atheist, and I think that the explanation of that the mechanisms is utterly and totally flawed. But there is nothing in a Protestant Reformed tradition which requires me to take an anti-science stance on geology, on biology, on GM foods, on cloning, or on any of those issues. If we go back to Mendy Chalmers, they have a remarkably positive attitude towards science on all of those issues. Chalmers also endorsed the emerging discipline of biblical criticism, especially on the matters of the text. Maybe just again say that there was that whole generation of outstanding, gigantic theologians, with Chalmers, Cunningham, Candice, John Duncan, and C.H. Spurgeon as well. They never had any sympathy with everything that only the authorized version was the Bible, and that only the received text was the authentic text of the Bible. These men were perfectly comfortable with the whole idea that we had to engage in a very exact science to ascertain what the text actually was. No, I'm not saying, but that eventually Chalmers' encouragement of that new discipline had some undesirable consequences, but that does not mean that he was to blame for those consequences. I'm not sure how interested any of you are in the whole idea of the extent of the atonement. Was the atonement universal? Did Christ die for all men? But you may know that in confessional Calvinism, the idea is that Christ died for the elect. And Chalmers was happy enough with that as a doctrine, although he would have said to you, I don't mind the answer, but I do mind the question. And Chalmers took the view that although the gospel was not universal in its effect, it was universal, as he said in his Latinate English, it was universal in proposition. That is, it is to be proposed to every human being. And when a man hears the gospel, Chalmers said, he is not required or allowed to ask, am I elect? Or to go back to eternity and see his name is in God's eternal decree. Nor is he required to go to the day of judgment and see himself appearing among the sheep on the day of judgment. He is required only to believe the gospel, not to go back or to go forward, back to eternity or forward to judgment. The one thing is, here and now, he is addressed by God. He is told by God to come unto me, inquire to believe, and that is the only pertinent fact in a situation at that point as it sits under the gospel of Jesus Christ. Let me close by just reminding you some of the memorable aphorism of which Chalmers is still perhaps worth recalling. Chalmers was above all else a preacher, and he was a preacher of remarkable power. He wasn't simply a great preacher. He was an orator such as far as I can see, the English language has never known before or since. He was compared in his own day to Demosthenes, the famous Greek orator. And those who heard Chalmers preach spoke of it as wizardry because of the effects it could produce. There is no doubt whatever that he was absolutely mesmeric. And it's quite difficult sometimes to know where the effect came from. It was partly the sheer physical force of his own delivery. It was partly also the fact that Chalmers' sermons contain one idea which is relentlessly and repeatedly emphasized and put in this light and that light, seen from this point of view and then from that point of view, until it has possessed the hearer. That's how it seems to do its work. And sometimes in Chalmers too there's a tremendous visual quality. He makes you see things. You see in Chalmers' sermon, you see the kingdom of the blessed. You can almost see it physically with your own eyes. And he himself was quite unconscious of his powers at many levels. Even on one occasion when Chalmers preached sitting down, he mesmerized his congregation. And that was an audience of old Etonians and through blue upper crust Englishmen. He was preaching on that occasion, lecturing on the establishment principle and in relation to the church's spiritual independence. And he closed his discourse by recalling the aphorism, "An Englishman's home is his castle." And he said, and he was sitting down then because he wasn't well, it needn't, he said, have walls or battlements. It may be only a straw cottage. Every wind of heaven, he said, may blow upon it. Every element may enter it. And then he stood and he said, but the king cannot. The king dare not. That was dramatizing this whole idea that the government had no place in the church and it had no place in the home. And as an aside, I want to put it to you that we have allowed far too much state meddling in the domestic situation and far too much intrusion into an area where the state has no business. And we would do well to remember Chalmers' point with regard to our homes being our castles. Every wind of heaven may blow upon them. All the elements may fly through them. But the state cannot. And the state dare not. And we should, I think, try to insist on that more than we do. Chalmers also had a great sermon on the expulsive power of a new affection, the expulsive power of a new love. Why don't Christians love the world? Why don't they love its pleasures? And why do they pursue its treasures? Well, Chalmers said they used to. And they thought they were lovely. And they are lovely. And Chalmers drew this brilliant picture of all the beauty of this world's treasures and pleasures. I made them all so magnificent. But then he said, another vista passes before their eyes, the sight of the land of the blessed. And once they have seen that, all other love is expelled. not because the world is ugly or its pleasures or its treasures are dark and corrupt, but because they have seen the King in his beauty, and that love for him expels all other loves. Chalmers spoke too of the power of littleness. Again, this is part of his mathematical kind of intellect. He had built the Free Church on the power of littleness. He had said, I will not build this church, he said, on the magnificent donations of the rich, but I will build it on the pennies of the poor. And then word came back to Chalmers, and I say this with some embarrassment, that the Highlanders were saying that they could not afford to support the church. They were too poor. And Chalmers said, what on the power of littles? The planet Jupiter, he said, that is the biggest mass in our galaxy. That planet is made up of infinitesimals. It is an aggregate of elements infinitesimally small. I want to build a church on infinitesimals, on small things, from small things. And then he rather naughtily turned and he said, I see, he said, from the excise report, that the island of Islay alone has spent £6,000 this year on snuff. And he said, if the Highlanders will sacrifice just 1/10 of their snuff, that'll be enough to maintain the church. The power of littles. The Highlanders never liked Chalmers. There was a famous Free Church assembly in Inverness in the late 1843, and all the Highland body and the men thought it was to be some great mega communion, and they came from far and wide to this assembly. And you know what assemblies are? They're always about finance and deficits and money and so on. And there was huge disappointment, and Chalmers was the worst of all. And they went home saying he's unco-worldly because he spoke only about money. It's an old complaint. But maybe the most important thing of all about Chalmers is his commitment to what he called the Christian good of Scotland. And what a vision that is for us, even today, the Christian good of Scotland. Not the good of one denomination, not its economic and cultural good or prosperity, not even simply its spiritual good, but its good in the most comprehensive sense. Its economic good, its cultural good, people living in dignity with proper employment, proper housing. That was part of Chalmers' passion. But above all, their spiritual good. He said once famously, who cares about the Free Church? Who cares about any church save as an instrument of Christian good? That's what we exist for. We don't exist to perpetuate ourselves. We exist for the good of Scotland. We exist for the Christian good of Scotland. And that perhaps is the ultimate challenge. Chalmers did give a huge amount of attention to the social problems of both Edinburgh and Glasgow, and a huge attention too to the nation's spiritual needs. But it was all driven by this coherent vision You are here for the Christian good of Falkirk. And when I say that, I recall the disturbing words of Bonhoeffer from his prison cell in 1944. Are we still of any use? Who cares for any church save as an instrument of Christian good? I doubt if we'll ever again see a Thomas Chalmers. Men are products of their own time. But we have to be grateful to God for raising him up, and he is still, I think, one of the most inspiring figures in the whole of our Scottish history. Not a flawless man, any more than St. Paul was, a human man, but a man who has left us with great vision and great principles. So shall we then pursue the Christian good of Scotland, implementing the power of infinitesimals. We are all so small. All I can do is so small. And yet the accumulative power of littles, that is a great thing. Well, I leave it there.